Hey everyone, welcome back to Paranormal Asia. Tonight's story comes from Hong Kong, where ferries glide through the dark waters long after the city lights fade. The last ferry of the night is often quiet, nearly empty, but in this tale, that silence hides something you'll never forget. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's midnight, maybe you're traveling, maybe you're about to sleep. Wherever you are, keep that in mind, because this story is about a journey you cannot escape. This story is true, shared by locals, and whispered in dockside neighborhoods for decades. They call it the last ferry curse. Sailors and commuters alike know the superstition. Never ride the very last ferry home unless you must. If you do, don't sit near the back. The characters in this story were ordinary people, nothing unusual about them. A young office worker named Clara, exhausted from overtime, her colleague Simon, who never liked the quiet of the sea, and an old man named Mr. Cheung, a regular commuter who claimed he had seen strange things before. Clara was the kind of person who always carried an extra umbrella in her bag, even on clear days. Simon smoked too much and used the ferry rides as excuses to sneak away for a cigarette. And Mr. Cheung, he spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. The ferry that night was half-lit, its lights flickering in dull yellow tones. Most of the seats were empty. The workers on board had faces that looked just as tired as the passengers. Outside, the waves slapped against the hull, steady, repetitive, like a clock counting down. Hong Kong ferries have long carried more than just passengers. Local folklore says the sea spirits travel with them, wandering souls that cling to water roots. Taoist monks used to bless boats before their first voyage of the year, leaving incense at the docks. But these rituals aren't always done anymore. That night, Clara sat near the middle, papers stacked neatly on her lap. Simon leaned by the railing outside, the red glow of his cigarette barely cutting through the mist. Mr. Cheung kept to his corner, eyes half closed, as though listening for something no one else could hear. When the engines rumbled and the ferry pulled away from the pier, the city lights faded fast. In their place came only the dark expanse of Victoria Harbour. The water was unusually calm, too calm. Locals say when the sea grows that still, it's not a blessing, but a warning. As the ferry cut across the water, Clara noticed the crew behaving strangely. They avoided the back rows of the cabin, refusing to sit or even lean there. One sailor dropped a rope and muttered under his breath. It was as though the last seats carried a weight no one wanted. Superstition surrounds seating on ferries. The last rows are often left empty, said to belong to passengers who never paid for their journey. Ghosts, in other words, people who drowned, people who never made it home, who still ride the waters at night looking for what they lost. Simon laughed it off when Clara mentioned it, brushing ash from his jacket, but Mr. Cheung lifted his head, his lined face catching the dim light. "Don't mock what you can't see," he said. "If the back is empty, let it stay that way. Better you don't find out why." The superstition is simple. If you sit in the wrong place, you might not return. Passengers who ignored the warnings were said to vanish. Sometimes their seats were left wet, as though someone dripping had sat there. Other times, shadows moved without bodies. None of it could be explained. For Clara, this was background noise, old men's stories. She just wanted to get home, eat instant noodles, and sleep. But Simon, restless and stubborn, grinned at the empty back row. He stubbed out his cigarette, walked over, and dropped himself into the last seat. "See? Nothing happened," he said. The ferry kept moving, waves brushing its sides, but Clara noticed something new. The air near Simon shifted, colder, heavier, the kind of chill that doesn't belong on humid Hong Kong nights. Mr. Cheung stared at Simon in silence. Somewhere beneath the boat, something began keeping pace with them. Clara's life was nothing unusual, and maybe that's why this story resonates with so many. She was 26, an office worker caught in the endless cycle of Hong Kong's late nights. Her desk was stacked with reports, her phone buzzing long after business hours. The ferry was her small moment of quiet between work and her cramped apartment in Kowloon. To her, the night ride wasn't a choice, it was necessity. Simon was different. He was her coworker, always rebellious, always late, always looking for ways to prove he wasn't like everyone else. If Clara was a shadow of routine, Simon was the echo of mischief. He liked staying behind, smoking at the ferry's edge, telling stories about nightlife Clara never joined. She tolerated him because sometimes on nights like this, his chatter kept her awake long enough not to collapse. Then there was Mr. Cheung. Nobody knew where he lived, but everyone on that route had seen him at one point or another. His clothes were plain, worn with age, but his eyes carried something heavier. When he spoke, it was always about rules, things you should not do, places you should not sit. He was the type of old man whose silence felt louder than words. That evening, the three of them shared the same ferry by coincidence. To Clara, it was just another ride. To Simon, it was a chance to mock old tales, and to Mr. Cheung, it was the start of something he had been dreading. The ferry's hum filled the cabin, low and constant. Outside, the harbor stretched black and endless, broken only by faint reflections of lights along the shore. Clara leaned back in her seat, eyes burning from too much screen time, thinking of the instant noodles waiting at home. Her body begged for sleep, but something about the cabin's atmosphere refused to let her drift. Simon, meanwhile, couldn't resist poking at superstition. He stretched his legs across the back row, whistling softly, tapping his shoe against the seat frame. "Ghost passengers," he muttered, half to himself. "If they're here, where's my free drink?" He laughed, but the sound felt out of place, as though the air swallowed it faster than normal. Mr. Cheung shifted in his seat. He hadn't moved much since the ferry left the dock, but now his eyes were fixed firmly on Simon. His face didn't show anger, only resignation, as though he'd seen this before and already knew how it would end. Clara caught the look but decided not to ask. Ferry rides were supposed to be simple, a handful of passengers, a straight route across familiar waters, but even the crew avoided Simon's row, glancing at him quickly, then turning their eyes away. Clara felt a ripple of unease move through the cabin. It wasn't just about superstition anymore. It was about the silence that followed Simon's laughter, the silence that seemed too aware. Outside, Simon lit another cigarette and leaned back, looking into the night. The glow of the ember made his face flicker between light and shadow. Clara stayed where she was, unable to shake the odd heaviness in the air. She watched the water through the window, dark, still, unnervingly still. Hong Kong's harbor was rarely quiet. Even late at night, waves usually slapped at the hull. Tugboats moved in the distance, gulls cried overhead. But tonight the water looked like polished stone, undisturbed except for the ferry's wake. Clara pressed her palm against the glass and felt a chill that made her recoil. Mr. Cheung coughed once, his voice rough with age. "The sea is too quiet tonight," he murmured. Clara looked over, surprised he was speaking at all. His words felt less like observation, more like a warning. Simon exhaled smoke and rolled his eyes, muttering something about old men and ghost stories, but Clara couldn't ignore it. She had grown up hearing her grandmother's warnings. Don't whistle at night, don't point at the moon, don't tempt what doesn't belong to you. To mock superstition was to invite something closer. She wanted to tell Simon to move, to come sit with her, but the words caught in her throat. The ferry pressed on, engine steady, yet the night outside felt stretched, as though time itself had slowed. Clara glanced at her phone. No signal, no messages, just a blank screen reflecting her own uneasy face back at her. Minutes ticked by, though Clara couldn't tell how many. The ferry's cabin felt smaller somehow, the ceiling lower, the rows longer. She thought it was exhaustion, the kind that makes reality feel thin. Simon stayed sprawled in the back, humming tunelessly, tapping his foot like he was daring the silence to answer. Mr. Cheung finally spoke again, louder this time, his voice carrying across the empty rows. "Some ferries never dock," he said. Clara blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. Simon chuckled, clapping his hands once. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, though the old man didn't reply. He just stared at Simon, his eyes glinting in the weak cabin light. Clara tried to shake it off, but her skin prickled. Her grandmother used to talk about ferries and buses that carried extra passengers, those who weren't living, but weren't willing to leave either. If you boarded alongside them, you might never step off. It was just folklore, but folklore has roots somewhere. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, before steadying again. Clara glanced around. No one else seemed alarmed, not even the crew, who moved with deliberate avoidance of the back row. It was as though they were trained not to see it. Simon stretched his arms wide, mocking the moment. "Guess I've got the row all to myself." But as he leaned back, Clara thought she saw the outline of another headrest dip slightly, like someone invisible had just sat down beside him. Clara told herself it was fatigue, her imagination playing tricks, but she couldn't shake what she thought she saw. That slight movement of the seat, the faint shift of air, as though another passenger had joined Simon. She closed her eyes tightly, willing it away, but when she opened them, Simon was staring at her, grinning. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he teased. Mr. Cheung did not laugh. His hands were folded tightly together, knuckles pale, his gaze fixed on Simon. He seemed to be waiting, almost counting down. Clara realized then that this wasn't just a warning from a superstitious old man. This was recognition. Mr. Cheung knew the signs. He had seen this before. The ferry cut deeper into the harbor, engines grinding softly. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the horizon. The water seemed to rise higher against the windows, though the tide shouldn't have shifted so quickly. Clara pressed her lips together, forcing herself not to ask what time it was. She didn't want to know. Simon, restless as ever, drummed his fingers on the empty seat beside him. "Guess I'm not alone after all," he joked, though his voice cracked slightly, betraying a sliver of unease. Clara's heart thudded harder. The ferry wasn't supposed to feel like this, like a sealed room drifting further from the world they knew. And in that heavy silence, Clara swore she heard the faint sound of water dripping somewhere it shouldn't. The drip Clara heard became rhythmic, like footsteps hidden in water. She searched the cabin for the source, but nothing leaked, nothing spilled, yet the sound persisted, slow and steady, as if a wet body were moving unseen down the aisle. Her throat tightened. She wanted to call out to Simon, but his grin had faded. He now sat stiffly, staring at the seat beside him. The dip in the cushion was deeper than before. Clara saw it clearly this time, not an illusion of tired eyes. The fabric pressed inward, the way it does when someone sits. Simon shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his arms as if a draft had wrapped around him. "It's cold back here," he muttered, voice thin. The other passengers pretended not to notice. A young woman across the aisle buried her face deeper in her phone, though her fingers trembled. A sailor passed quickly through the cabin, eyes fixed ahead, deliberately avoiding Simon's row. Only Mr. Cheung looked, his gaze steady, sorrowful. "Once they sit," he said softly, "they don't stand up again." The cabin lights flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness. When they returned, Clara's breath caught. There was moisture on the seat beside Simon, a faint sheen of water soaking into the fabric, darkening it slowly. Clara pressed her nails into her palm, grounding herself. She tried to look away, but the wet stain spread further, too real to dismiss. Simon wiped at his arm suddenly, then froze. His sleeve was damp. He glanced around, panic flickering across his face before he masked it with bravado. "Probably condensation," he said, but the excuse fell flat. The air inside the ferry was heavy, but not humid. Clara's instincts screamed that the moisture wasn't natural. Mr. Cheung closed his eyes briefly, whispering something under his breath. Prayer maybe, or a plea. Then came the smell. It seeped into the cabin subtly at first, then thickened, heavy and unmistakable. Salt, rot, the stench of seaweed pulled from deep water where sunlight never reaches. Clara gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve. Simon coughed harshly, muttering about bad plumbing, but no pipe could carry this scent. The young woman with the phone rose abruptly, stumbling forward toward the crew. "I need fresh air," she murmured, voice shaky. The crew didn't argue. They led her quickly out onto the deck as though they'd expected someone to break. Clara looked back at Simon. His defiance was crumbling. He rubbed at the seat beside him, but his hand recoiled instantly. His palm was wet, freezing, colder than the water outside. The stain had grown darker, and if Clara's eyes weren't deceiving her, it was beginning to take the faint outline of a handprint. The ferry's engines roared louder, pushing against the current, yet Clara noticed something terrifying. The boat didn't seem to be moving. Through the window, the shore remained distant, unmoving, as though the ferry were caught in place. She pressed her face against the glass. The mist had thickened into a wall. Simon stood abruptly, shaking his arms as if to rid himself of invisible rain. His face had lost its cocky smile. "This isn't funny anymore," he muttered, voice cracking. He stumbled toward Clara's row, but froze mid-step. A sound rose from the back seat, the unmistakable squelch of waterlogged cloth shifting. Clara's stomach twisted. It wasn't just the seat sinking. Something invisible was moving, adjusting, as though making itself comfortable. The air grew colder, sharp against her skin. She thought she saw condensation bloom faintly across the window near Simon, small droplets sliding down though the glass was sealed tight. Mr. Cheung's voice carried again, heavy with certainty. "You gave them your seat," he said. His words weren't cruel, just fact. Clara's hands shook. She wanted to reach for Simon, to pull him closer, but she was afraid of what might come with him. A crewman entered, glanced at Simon and paled instantly. He whispered harshly to another sailor at the doorway. The two men exchanged looks, neither stepping forward. Clara realized then, this wasn't the first time the crew had seen this. They were simply waiting for it to pass, but this time, it wasn't passing. Clara couldn't take it anymore. She rose from her seat and crossed the aisle toward Simon, forcing herself to breathe steadily. The smell of brine intensified near the back, clawing at her throat. She grabbed Simon's wrist, pulling him forward. His skin was freezing as though he'd plunged into winter water. He resisted weakly. "I can't," he whispered, eyes darting to the empty seat. His face had gone pale, drained of defiance. Clara followed his gaze, and her breath froze. The wet stain had spread upward, climbing the backrest. It was no longer just damp fabric. It was forming the outline of a shoulder, a head, a figure sitting where nothing visible belonged. Simon's knees buckled. Clara yanked him harder, dragging him into the aisle. The other passengers avoided their eyes, shrinking away, unwilling to interfere. Only Mr. Cheung remained steady, his gaze locked on the seat. He muttered something in Cantonese that Clara didn't catch, words that carried rhythm like ritual. Then, the ferry lurched violently. The lights flickered again. Clara and Simon fell hard to the floor as the cabin tilted. A sailor shouted something to the helm, but his words were drowned out by a deafening splash from the water outside, as though something massive had surfaced beneath them. Simon clutched Clara's arm, trembling. "We're not supposed to leave," he said, voice hoarse. Clara wanted to scream back, but before she could, droplets of water began to fall, not from the ceiling, but from mid-air, as though raining from an unseen presence. The cabin was chaos now. Passengers scrambled forward, pressing toward the front of the ferry. Crew members barked orders, but none dared approach the back row. Clara pulled Simon with all her strength, dragging him toward safety, though his feet moved sluggishly as if weighted. Every breath he exhaled came out as mist. Behind them, the invisible passengers stirred. The wet seat creaked, shifting as though someone heavier had leaned forward. Clara didn't dare look back, but she heard it, the slow drip of water hitting the floor, steady, deliberate pacing them. Mr. Cheung rose finally, walking toward Clara and Simon with a firmness that belied his age. He pulled a small object from his pocket, a folded piece of red paper, edges stained from time. Clara recognized it instantly, a talisman, old but still potent. He pressed it into Clara's trembling hands. "Keep moving," he ordered. His voice was low but commanding. For the first time, the other passengers looked at him, their fear mingled with relief that someone had finally acted. The ferry groaned again, its engines straining. Clara clutched Simon and the talisman, pushing forward step by step. But in her ears rang something far worse than the mechanical noise, a whisper, faint but distinct, brushing against her mind as though spoken underwater. It said her name. Clara didn't know whether the whisper came from inside her skull or from the last row that refused to stay empty. It slid through her like cold smoke, syllables softened by water, a voice that knew her name and the exact pitch of her fear. She hauled Simon forward, shoulder burning, while Mr. Cheung shadowed them at a measured pace, every step deliberate, like a shoreline holding back a tide. The engines howled. Through the window, the skyline floated at a fixed distance, wrong in a way that made the stomach lurch. The aisle stretched too long, as if the ferry had grown a rib. Then the pressure changed. Eardrums throbbed. Drops fell quicker, stitching a wet path along the aisle. One touched Clara's wrist, and stung with a cold that felt older than winter. Simon's breath came in thin white threads. His bravado had gone hollow. "Don't answer it," Mr. Cheung said, voice even, as if reciting a rule. "If it speaks again, do not answer." It spoke. The voice leaned past Simon's shoulder, nearer than breath, a tide-swallowed whisper asking the simplest question the drowned ever ask. "Who will trade seats?" Clara's fist tightened around the talisman. The red paper warmed faintly, an ember in fog. She remembered her grandmother's rules: never bargain at sea, never look back after midnight, never offer your full name to water. She kept her eyes on the bow and kept moving, understanding the ritual without being taught, forward, together, without reply, step by step. A shudder ran through the hull, not from waves but from something brushing underneath, a slow drag like a net catching bones. The cabin lights dimmed to a sickly yellow. Ahead, the mist drew together into a wall with a seam, as though a mouth waited where the harbor should be. The crew muttered, working controls that answered sluggishly, as if the boat were being held. Mr. Cheung moved to the aisle's center, lifted his chin, and began speaking, not loud, not theatrical, but precise. The words were Cantonese layered with old charms, names of rivers and borrowed breaths. With his left hand, he traced an invisible circle around Clara and Simon. With his right, he flicked water away from their path. The drops recoiled, veering sideways, as if the air itself remembered a different geometry. "Keep your eyes forward," he said. "Count 9 breaths." Clara obeyed, though she didn't know why 9 mattered. Simon clung to the seat back, shaking, the cold crawling inside his joints. Behind them, the last row exhaled, the wet cushion flexed, followed by a slick sound of fabric sliding. The invisible passenger stood. Clara felt its height, its lean, the long angle of a soaked shoulder pausing just beside Simon's ear. The whisper asked again, as polite as it was merciless, "Who will trade seats?" Mr. Cheung answered without answering. He named the ferry, the route, the living aboard, and the debt already paid by tides. The lights steadied. The wall of mist split an inch. Clara expected a legend to crash over them like thunder. Instead, the revelation arrived quietly, carried in Mr. Cheung's unbroken tone. He spoke of a storm 5 years ago, a commuter in the back row who slipped between railing and night. No splash, no shout. The crew searched, filed reports, burned incense, and still the seat stayed wet for weeks. Some roots keep their dead close, he said, eyes unfocused, as if reading from the fog. They ride until someone breaks the rule. They need a name, they need a place. His gaze flicked to Simon. They take the one who answers. Simon swallowed hard. I didn't answer, he whispered, but Clara remembered his jokes, the way he'd addressed the air, invited company with sarcasm shaped too much like permission. The water does not speak law, it hears the shape of intention. The ferry groaned, the deck flexing as though bearing two weights where there should be one. Somewhere deep below, a bell struck once, metal on metal, like a buoy calling through the lungs of the boat. The whisper pressed closer, patient, unchanged. Mr. Cheung's hand trembled now. It isn't only that man, he admitted. Old drownings stitched together. The back row is a pocket. Clara saw it then, the outline of more than one passenger layered within the dim. A crowd collapsed into a single absence that the eye could not hold. Name the living again, Mr. Cheung told her, out loud. Anchors always need names. Clara obeyed immediately. Clara spoke their names like buoys. Herself, Simon, Mr. Cheung, the crew, the woman who'd fled to the deck, the silent passengers huddled forward. Each name steadied the air a fraction. Mr. Cheung guided her count. 9 breaths, 9 heartbeats, 9 taps of his knuckles against the metal rail. The talisman burned warmer in Clara's fist. The invisible passenger leaned in, pressing a chill through Simon's jacket. He sagged. Clara hooked her arm through his and kept talking, soft and even, refusing the cadence of fear. Mr. Cheung lifted his right hand and scraped his fingernail across the talisman's edge, releasing a smell of singed paper and salt. Not tonight, he said, addressing the aisle without looking back. Not while the living still have a root. The ferry jerked forward a hand's length, then halted, as if a rope had snapped tight around its waist. From the bow came a loud crack. The mist seam spread wider, revealing a strip of black water that looked heavier than the rest. Passable, but only if the boat hit it in one breath. The helm answered with throttle. Engines screamed. The last row sighed. Water fell in threads. The whisper shifted tactics, new words forming like bubbles breaking. Say his name for us. Trade sorrow for passage. Clara shook her head, repeating the living. Mr. Cheung drew a circle in the air, then sliced it open. The ferry lunged, catching the opening before it healed. The deck bucked. Clara held. Simon gasped forward only. They burst through the split in the fog like a cork from a bottle, the harbor's true lights snapping back into alignment. Noise returned all at once. Distant horns, gulls, the honest slap of waves. Clara almost laughed from relief, but then she felt it, something still clung. The last row wasn't empty yet. Simon trembled violently, teeth chattering. A print the size of a hand bloomed pale on his sleeve, water whitening the fabric in the shape of long fingers. Mr. Cheung's mouth tightened. He pressed the talisman flat against Simon's chest and whispered the last cadence, a tone that sounded less like words and more like turning a key. The paper flared without flame, then dimmed. Keep looking forward, he told them. Do not thank me yet. The ferry nosed toward the pier. Rope swung. Dock hands called out numbers, but every second seemed stacked on top of another, fragile, ready to slide. The presence behind them withdrew, inch by grudging inch, as though reluctant to lose its claim. At the final jolt of mooring, a soft sound rose, almost a sigh, almost a tide receding through teeth. The pressure eased. The print on Simon's sleeve faded to damp cloth. Clara dared a breath that didn't taste like salt. Then the PA crackled with a static that spoke in vowels. A name spilled out, old and mispronounced. The crew went still. Mr. Cheung shut his eyes. It remembers, he said. Debts keep calendars we cannot see. It is not over. They docked, but the relief felt thin, like cling film over deep water. Dock hands tossed lines, shouted numbers, and pretended not to look at the back row. Simon could stand again, yet his knees rattled. Cold leaked from him like fog. Clara kept the talisman to his chest until Mr. Cheung eased her fingers away. Don't smother its work, he said. Let it cool. The PA sputtered into ordinary static. Passengers filed out in a tight stream, heads lowered, carrying silence like luggage. Outside, the pier's boards creaked with honest wood. Neon braided across puddles like ribbons. Clara wanted to run, to put concrete between herself and the harbor, but Mr. Cheung guided them to a small shrine beside a humming vending machine, the kind people pass without seeing. Joss ash had collapsed into gray hills. A glass cup held rainwater beaded with oil. For crossings, he murmured, for those who don't finish them. Clara lit incense with shaking hands. The flame hesitated, then caught, a thin orange nerve in the wind. Smoke curled upward and set the night's shape again. Simon hugged himself, shivering. Is it over? He asked, voice scraped flat. Cheung watched the ferry's windows, dark rectangles reflecting the pier like calm, squared eyes. Journeys end in steps, he said at last. Some end quickly, some end over many nights. Keep walking until your name feels heavy again. The harbor answered with little slaps of wave against pilings, sounds returning. Behind them, the ferry hummed, waiting. The shrine altered the night, the way a key shifts a lock. Wind moved around it, slower, as if the air remembered which names belonged where. Mr. Cheung set 3 coins on the red sill, aligning them with his thumbnail. Payment, he said, not to buy safety, to acknowledge debts. He wasn't a priest, just an old commuter who carried rules the way sailors carry knots. He took the talisman back from Simon, folded it into a triangle, and tapped each corner through the incense smoke. Why me? Simon asked, voice raw. I didn't answer. You joked, Cheung said gently. Jokes are agreements in a place that listens. He lifted his sleeve. Beneath, a pale oval marked his wrist. Old water scar, the shape of a hand. I kept the back row 30 years ago. Thought it would make me brave. I came home, but not alone. He replaced his cuff and looked over the harbor. Some nights it hums like it knows the way back to my apartment. He handed Clara a second paper charm, smaller, edged with grease. Carry this when you cross. 9 breaths in, 9 out. Say the living on the exhale. Clara nodded, the ritual feeling strange and necessary. Cheung's eyes softened. If the PA calls a name you don't recognize, breathe again. If water asks for kindness, pay it with space, not speech. A ferry horn sounded, low as a warning. Incense burned to ash. The cup of rain stilled. For a heartbeat, the harbor held its breath with them. They separated near the taxi rank, where engines idled, wet tires hissing. Simon insisted he was fine, but his teeth kept clicking. A metronome the night would not forgive. Clara wrote her number on his palm anyway. Call when you're in, she said. He nodded and pocketed the shaking hand like a secret. Clara's bus arrived empty. She chose the middle seat deliberately, knees tight, eyes on the aisle. City lights strobed ordinary through the glass. Home smelled like detergent and last night's tea. She showered, scalding away ghost cold. When she stepped out, the mirror had fogged from steam, and from 5 wet fingerprints pressed at shoulder height on the glass, long and patient, as if something taller had stood behind her for the count of 9. She didn't scream. She whispered names instead, her own, Simon, Cheung, guard downstairs. She opened the window, let city air scrape the room. Outside, horns braided with waves, noise returning. She wiped the prints with a towel and watched them thin, as if testing space. She set a bowl of clean water on the sill and an orange on a saucer. Her phone buzzed. A message from Simon. Home. Thanks. No punctuation. No bravado. She exhaled and left the TV murmuring for company. Before bed, she slid the charm beneath her pillow and dreamed of ferries that never docked, of seats learning the shape of anyone who stayed too long. Sleep came like a ferry, nosing a berth you want to miss. Some stories end at the pier. Ours must pause at the shrine. In Hong Kong and across the Pearl River Delta, people tell tales about water ghosts, restless souls who drowned and now pull the living down to trade places. They're not cheap monsters, they're bankrupt travelers. During Hungry Ghost Month, families burn paper boats and lanterns so the lost can find a route that isn't human skin. Ferries receive blessings, old-timers count breaths, some avoid the last row. The rule is simple, leave a seat open for the unfinished. If you sit there, you owe attention. Talismans like the one Mr. Cheung carried aren't wizardry, they're reminders that names matter, and breath orders the body, and that gratitude is paid forward. 9 repeats because it refuses to close cleanly, it resists ending. Jokes are dangerous aboard water because tone confuses borders. You don't bargain with tides, you acknowledge them and step forward together. Leave space in the back for whoever is still finishing their crossing. It costs you nothing, and it may cost them everything. Even in a modern city of schedules and LED rails, people carry rules like this. They keep ferries human and names heavy enough to anchor. Fishermen once knotted red thread to railings. Clerks tuck incense ash into ticket sleeves. Neighbors set fruit on damp windowsills. Stigmatized places. Rooms touched by sea deaths. Rent cheaper, yet fill slower, because debt travels. Belief isn't spectacle, it's etiquette, a way to cross without trespass. Weeks later, Clara avoided the last ferry, but still felt watched whenever mist braided itself low over the harbor. Simon stopped joking. On rain nights, he left an orange by the shrine and counted 9 breaths. Crew kept mopping around the back row. The salt ring never dried. Clara's life tilted, not shattered. She worked and laughed, but water found her in small ways. Shoes damp on dry floors, mirrors blooming with prints that thinned when she named the living. Sometimes the garage PA coughed a vowel she didn't recognize. She breathed again and kept walking. Mr. Cheung nodded when their paths crossed on the pier. He never asked for thanks, only that name still sounded heavy out loud. Once Clara saw him pour half his tea into the rain cup, a commuter's libation. Maybe that's the twist. Nothing cinematic, just a life bent toward caution. The seat stayed empty because someone remembered it. The city kept moving because debts were acknowledged. Sometimes the PA still coughs a shape that might be a name. If you hear it and the air tastes like old rain, don't answer. Breathe. Name the living. Walk forward without looking back. Where are you watching from now, and what time is it there? If a ferry runs near you, would you dare ride the last one and sit in the back row alone? Or would you leave that seat open, a kindness for the unfinished? Tell me below, then sleep, if the harbor lets you. The harbor doesn't really close. Ferries still move, seats still wait, and debts still circle like tides. Tonight's crossing ends here, but the water never forgets names spoken aloud. Maybe you'll fall asleep with this story clinging at the edges, or maybe you'll hear a drip in your room where no pipe runs. If you do, don't answer. Just breathe, count, and keep your eyes forward. We'll leave this ferry behind, but the night isn't finished. Somewhere else in Asia, another story has already begun. Another journey where a single mistake lets something climb aboard. When you're ready, follow us into the next crossing. We'll be waiting in the dark, already on the boat, already in the seat you didn't choose. So rest carefully if you can. And remember, not every goodbye is spoken. Some linger in silence, some ride home with you. Watch the next story, if you're certain you want another passenger tonight.